In 1911, the Richmond Theater fire occurred on the evening of December 26th. It occurred in a packed theater in Richmond, Virginia. It was the height of the holiday season, and it was the beginning of the legislative session. So all the movers and shakers of Richmond were present. The theater was literally the place to see and be seen. Nearly 600 people packed into the theater. And what that represented was really about 1% of the whole population of Richmond's 10,000 residents. And they were there to see a series of plays and sketches the day after Christmas. What happened was a partially extinguished chandelier was raised into the fly area of the theater. The chandelier caught some extra sets on fire, and those started raining down on the stage. What ensued was a horrible fire that killed 54 women and more than 20 men. In 1911, the Richmond Theater fire was really the worst urban disaster that our young nation had experienced. And in fact, it had such a psychological impact that people in Congress wore black crepe mourning armbands for a month, and the fire dominated conversations for weeks afterwards all along the eastern seaboard. In terms of shock and awe, the fire was something like the Galveston hurricane, the Jonestown flood, or other great natural disasters that have stuck in our kind of collective memory and our collective psychology. It really ended up being the defining moment for a whole generation of Americans. I selected this case study for a couple of reasons. One of them being that I'm a history buff. I really like urban history and urban archaeology, and when I read the case study, it really got my interest going. The other reason is that I think it really demonstrates both the abilities of government to respond to disasters and emergencies and accidents, and then it also highlights really the limits of government and the power of people to respond and help each other. So at the time in American history, there was really just a handful of organized fire brigades. And fire brigades were really kind of a volunteer enterprise. Some of them were actually private companies, almost like clubs that people could join. Some were actually sponsored by insurance companies. But what happened was that they really lacked organization, they lacked equipment and skills, and of course we're talking about 1811. So really, they didn't have a lot of equipment to rely on. Also, there were no building codes at that time in America. There was no code enforcement, no building inspections, at least not as we know it now. And municipal government had a much smaller role, a much more narrowly defined role, and really there weren't that many employees with much power at all. What stands out in the Richmond Theater fire is that individual effort is really what saved the day. And there's a couple of people that I want to talk about. One was a guy named Gilbert Hunt. He was actually an enslaved blacksmith. And Mr. Hunt was leaving church that evening. He heard the commotion. Actually, the woman who owned him screamed to him and told him to run back to the theater. He ran to the theater. He grabbed a mattress from somewhere along the way. And then he worked with a prominent doctor who was stranded in the top floors of the theater. And they lowered a dozen women out of those lower windows, and they jumped, and Mr. Hunt helped them to be safe and land on that mattress. And really it was that coordinated effort that helped those dozen or more women survive. And then there was also, of course, countless other people who helped each other to get to safety. The other thing is that from an infrastructure perspective, building fires were pretty common in America at that time, but they weren't necessarily very fatal. I guess for lots of reasons. Buildings weren't as large, people had easier ways to get in and out, etc. But what happened with this was that there was the calamity of it, there was the number of people, and then there was the way that the theater was constructed. The fire burned for only about 15 minutes, and what we know about fire is that fire doubles in size about every 90 seconds. So there was really no time for the limited amount of firefighters to get on the scene and do much good. The exits opened inwards, the doors opened inwards instead of outwards. The corridors were tiny, barely two people could walk side by side in the upper corridors. And then actually in that frantic emotion, people collided with each other, the corridors got clogged, and then the main staircase actually collapsed on itself. So what happened was that people were stranded on the 2 top floors, and they pushed or jumped or leapt out of windows to safety. Some people who leapt in sort of the wrong fashion landed in ways that actually caused more injury than helped them out, and several people were killed by jumping from the windows. Dr. Thornton, in the aftermath, he was a general practitioner doctor. He kept 3 horses at the ready because he had to do so many house calls after the fact to help people and tend to their injuries and their illness. We know that more people died after the fire, but we don't have a really accurate count. The official count is about 74 people. So in conclusion, what I think the Richmond fire represents is the worst aspects of infrastructure, the worst aspects of disregarding safety, knowing that the theater crowd was going to be very large, knowing that the theater could not accommodate that amount of people, but allowing it to happen anyway because it was the holiday season, the start of the legislative session. And then also, I think on the positive side, it really demonstrates how a community can come together, how people can help each other. And I think from being the disaster planner at the Department of Health in Hernando County, we rely a lot on citizens and residents coming together to help each other, on voluntary organizations helping residents and their constituents, because we know that government can't do all of it. From the perspective of the case study, I think the case study does a good job of looking at the Richmond Theater fire from a modern perspective, but I think that really it doesn't account for the fact that infrastructure and firefighting and building codes were so lacking at the time. And so when I did more research and I learned about that, that's what really helped me to understand the context of the fire. So I think that the case study did a pretty good job, but it needed a little bit more of historical research to make it a more complete picture. I've included this video on the University of Florida's website, and then I also included a PowerPoint with some photographs related to the fire and documentation, and then also a few references and resources that I used in my research. So I hope you've enjoyed this critique of the case study. Thank you. Okay, it's going to be busy for several minutes, I hope.
I'm scared to turn it off, so you turn it off. You did a fabulous job, Nina. Oh my gosh. Next time you ask me to videotape that, say something like, it's going to be a while because my arms and my legs are like, oh my God.